Douglas Winter.
I'm Jenny.
And I'm Ashley, and our topic today is clear cutting. So clear cutting began in the 1800s as a way to get lumber, but then at this time, a lot of the trees were of good quality, so it didn't matter how much they just cut whatever they wanted in the forest. And then it started changing in the 1950s because they realized that this wasn't working. Because what happened is that a lot of the trees became of poor quality because so many of the trees were being cut down and not being replanted. And because of this, in the 1950s, a lot of the people who were clear cutting would go into the forest, find the better quality trees, and leave behind the poor trees. And so today it has changed, become more of a harvesting and regeneration technique. So what is clear cutting? Clear cutting is essentially the removal of all trees from a tract of forest with few trees remaining. And the trees that are cut down are used for harvesting for wood and also clearing land because a lot of, What?
I was going to ask you to slow down.
Okay, sorry. So they clear the land so that all this land is arable, and they like to use it to plant crops and things. So they do clear the lands for farmers. And the last thing is used to regenerate trees. So after they've clear cut and removed the trees, they use the land to replant trees within the first 2 years. And this is done mostly in places like Oregon, where there are Douglas fir trees, where the seedlings can only grow when there's ample sunlight. So what they do is they clear out the forest, plant new trees, and then they can have healthier trees afterwards. These are a few pictures, so that shows the recent clear cut, and as you can see, it's not very pretty because they take out all the trees, but then they replant them, and it becomes nicer after a while. But a lot of people don't like the fact that there are just trees in patches and then patches of ugly dirt in the middle. So some of the challenges that I'll be talking about is the fact that clear cutting does create a loss of jobs, because before they did have people coming in with axes and saws to cut down the trees, but nowadays they have a big machine that just comes in and cuts down the trees really quickly, and people don't like the fact that there aren't as many employment opportunities. And also because so many trees are being taken out and the time that it takes to be replanted, there isn't as much of a good habitat for the animals that were originally in these forests. So people have proposed certain alternatives, and one of them is selective harvesting. So selective harvesting is almost like clear cutting, but what they do is that they come into the forest and they choose certain trees to cut down. So then certain trees are growing at the same time as old ones are already growing, so you don't have the big patches of the ugly dirt. And that's why they think it's a better alternative. And then another alternative is selective thinning, but it seems like selective harvesting is a little bit better because selective thinning still has clear cutting in it. So what they do is they just thin down the worst quality trees, and then they cut them down afterwards and then replant it anyways. And here are some pictures of the alternatives, which is selective harvesting and selective thinning. And as you can see in the picture of selective thinning, they still have the clear cutting machine coming in.
Okay, so now I'll be talking about the pros and cons of clear cutting. We'll first start off with the pros. So clear cutting is supposed to be part of a sustainable forest management. It'll improve the forest health, productivity, and quality. By clear cutting, we can arrange habitat and wildlife population. It provides different structure and mass species suitable for different animal habitats and food needs. Because they are growing new trees every couple of years, animals can have more food sources, different kinds of food sources, and different types of habitats and structures to live in. It creates a wide open space that allows for most sun for tree species that require full sun conditions. Like Ashley said, there are Douglas fir trees that require a lot of sun, and clear cutting allows for all that sun to get into the tree. There are fewer disturbances to the forest floor because clear cutting quickly cuts through a lot of trees at once. People can cut down many trees, and the animals that live there won't be disturbed as many times. It's the most efficient and economic method for harvesting large groups of trees because it's done so quickly, and it requires less money because you don't have to pay for as much labor. And it is the most appropriate harvest method for certain tree species, like the Douglas fir shown on the bottom corner. And here's a little video about clear cutting.
Clear cutting. In order to have the wood and paper we use every day, we need to harvest and replant a lot of trees. In some forests, this often involves harvesting many trees at the same time. We call it a clear cut or regeneration harvest. Some people object to clear cutting. Yeah, we know, it's ugly. But they are replanted, and there's both an ecological and an economic reason for clear cuts. Some forests, such as Douglas fir in the west, aspen in the northern Midwest, and loblolly pine in the southeast, depend on full sunlight in order to thrive, especially when trees are young. Without full sun, they have a hard time growing, or often won't grow at all. Historically, full sun conditions happened after a large-scale disturbance, like a fire or a massive windstorm. Clear-cutting imitates events like these to create an open area where the new generation of trees get all the sun they need. Clear cuts also make sense economically. Large-scale harvest allows you to enter the forest once to harvest the trees. People refer to this as economies of scale. The fewer times you enter a forest, the less it costs to harvest the trees, and the less it disturbs forest soils, water quality, and wildlife habitat. Many states have laws that limit the size.
Okay, so yeah, that video was basically a summary of all the pros that I just talked about. Now here's for the cons. Okay, so the cons, because you are removing a lot of trees, you're destroying a lot of buffer zones, which can hurt like the severity of floods, which hurts the trees, the remaining trees, and then the animals who are also living there. The removal of forest carbon sinks increases global warming, which is really, really bad for everybody. And the removal of the forest canopy, basically it disturbs animals who rely on shade or rely on the protection that the trees give them, but since the trees are no longer there, they can't be protected. As long as, along with other plants that require shade that the trees provide them. It alters the habitat where trees once stood and displaces forest inhabitants into new areas. It eliminates fish and wildlife species due to soil erosion and habitat loss. Because the structures of the forests are changing, the animals can't adapt as quickly, and they're forced to move into other environments, and usually they can't adapt, so they do die out pretty quickly, as you can see from the elimination of fish and wildlife species. Another one is removal of groundworms, fungi, and bacteria that condition soil and protects plants from growing it from disease. So you can see here is a picture of a diseased tree because there aren't those organisms to protect plants. They're dying off, including the trees that are already that have been cut. There are also other trees that are dying too. So it's just like a lot of barren land. And there's a loss of small-scale economic opportunities and destruction of aesthetic value and recreation opportunities. A lot of places that people want to clear cut are around campsites or very big income-inducing places. So most people don't want to go camping near a place where it doesn't look nice or like has a bunch of barren land around. So that causes a lot of decrease in the economy in the area that wants to be clear cut.
Alright, so as we've seen, there's a lot of destruction on the sort of small local level with the clear cutting. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the global issue of deforestation and obviously there in clear cutting and the sustainability and the environmental impact of it all. In the last couple of decades, there's been a trend towards a new focus on sustainability and the impact of humans on the environment. Scientists are basically looking at the allocation and use of the limited resources that we have, and unsurprisingly, they found that we have many damaging practices. We're pretty much wrecking the environment. Clear cutting is sort of a proposed improvement, but it's actually still concerningly overusing the vulnerable resource of lumber. So even though they're saying it's healthy in this way, we're still, consumption demand is much greater than the rate of supply. So even though they're replanting these trees, we're using it much faster than we can grow them back. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the tragedy of the commons. Many of you already know this. We've talked about it a couple times in class. Basically, it's the issues of the herdsmen. They're on this communal pasture, and they all overuse the land. Basically, each herdsman's going to graze as many of his own individual cattle as he can. The main reason behind this is when it comes time to sell that cattle, he gets 100% of the profit from selling that cattle, but the consequence of overgrazing is split between all the other herdsmen. So basically, he receives 100% profit, but splits the consequence. Obviously, once all the herdsmen take that liberty, they surpass the carrying capacity, and the land becomes overgrazed and unusable for all of the herdsmen. So when we're talking directly about the clear cutting, we know what the negative effects are. We know that it's unsustainable, yet it's had little impact on the practice. There are some restorative actions being taken. They're mostly legal in the forms of fines and sanctions. These have been pretty unsuccessful. It is starting to become more of a social issue with organizations raising funds and awareness and things like that to try and get a movement going. You see this particularly in places like Yosemite National Parks. This mainly has to do with collective ownerships of the parks. People are using those parks and those facilities. They don't want them to be wrecked. The problem comes with private land ownership, because those private landowners can do what they want with their land, and they're choosing to get money and profit from selling to the logging industry. Basically, they say, if I don't do it, someone else will, which has been proven to be the case, so they're not going to miss out on their opportunity to profit from it. So this ties back nicely to Garden's tragedy of the commons, where it's this decision between this personal immediate gain right in front of them, or sort of a more long-term communal sustainability approach. And it appears that the immediate personal gain is significantly outweighing the greater good. Basically, so now we need to look at what's going to happen next. If we're not going to be able to cut back, something's got to happen. Either we're going to need better practices, something more sustainable. We're going to have to come up with some sort of synthetic materials to replace the use of lumber that we're using at the moment, or we might just have a full-on tragedy of commons disaster where we run out of that resource. To show you how quickly and efficiently that they do cut down these trees, here's the machine they use, and it shows you how quickly they can go from pulling the tree out of the ground to stripping it ready for transport. Basically, if you consider that these patches of land take about 10 years to regrow and they're cutting them down that quickly, you can see where the supply and demand is going to have an issue there. And that's pretty much our presentation. Thank you very much. Any questions?
So what's going to happen?
That's the question. I mean, we're using them at such a ridiculous rate. I mean, so National Geographic article that we have cited in our paper says that already over 50% of that rainforest have been taken down already for use of consumption. And the problem is also, it's not just the clear cutting, it's also for the arable farm usage. So obviously in that situation, you're not replanting the trees, because it's used for farming. Yep.
I mean, with replanting, are they replanting the same tree?
So that's part of that's one of the advantages they sort of list, is the fact that they can cut down these trees and plant sort of a variable amount of trees. But the problem is there's only a certain number of trees that need specific qualities of the light or certain things. So in some cases they're cutting down 6 or 7 different types of lumber and only replanting 3 things. So you're sort of really stagnating the development and the diversity of the trees that are in the land.
Also, if I may speak, you talk as if, or the industry talks as if replacing the trees is just as good as the original, but the new growth is as good as the old growth. At least some types of trees in some areas that I'm familiar with, the new growth, second growth, third growth, each successive growth, the trees are far, far less, at least impressive looking, and I'm sure have less quality to them.
And a lot of that comes down to the part we talked about in the ponds, where the soil diversity and the soil bacteria and fungi life in the soil is hurt every time you cut all those trees out. The diversity of trees also leads to diversity of organisms in the soil within those trees. So when you sort of bottleneck that effect, you're gonna lose some diversity.
I think also part of it is the way they justify it is that they're taking down like poor quality trees, but they're actually good trees. And they think that the way they're planting it will give you better quality, but then it makes like, they say that it looks ugly for a couple of years, but by like the next 10 years, it'll be better trees than there were before, so.
But the problem is then you have another patch that they have to clear cut out of the next one, so it doesn't really make it look any better.
You had a question?
Yeah, what is considered a low quality tree? For example, here in California, in the White Mountains, there's like the bristlecone tree, which is over 5,000 years old, one of the oldest trees in the world, and they have cut those down. A majority of them where only a small amount is left and is protected right now currently, but before, like a couple decades ago, they were cutting them all down. For example, those trees, they're not able to regrow, but would that be considered a bad tree? Like, what is a bad tree?
I think that's just a way for them to justify it and their way of cutting it down, because it's obviously not bad, because they're being used for different like things where we use wood for like your furniture and paper and those sorts of things. And that's just how they justify it. We're not saying that it's correct, we're just saying that's how the industry is.
I'm wondering what is a
saying
bad
it.
tree though in their eyes?
One that's not there in its natural habitat. I mean, I think the big reason you see the push for the sort of banning of cutting specifically in the national forests and things like that is for aesthetic quality or recreational purposes. I think there's sort of an innate now a new trend towards being environmentally sustainable and looking after the planet and things like that. Yeah.
If I was a logger, I think a bad tree would be a tree that I could really use for many purposes. Like, it's not as thick as other trees, it's infested with, stuff.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't particularly look into that for our report, but I'm sure with the clear cutting, because it's not selective cutting, so they're not picking that tree's a good tree, that tree's a good tree, they're just taking down everything. That's gonna include some trees that aren't usable, maybe there's dry rot, maybe, it's already dead, it has a fungus, it has a poison, something like that. So we didn't look into that, but I'm sure that would be an issue.